everyone, welcome to this tutorial. What we're going to have a look at today is creating silhouettes in Adobe Photoshop. So it's a great way of coming up with concepts. You can see here we've got some silhouettes from the TF2 or Team Fortress game, and this is a great way for defining our characters. And once we've got our silhouettes, we can go ahead, we can add some color, we can add some values, light to dark, we can add some effects and really flesh those characters out. But it is a very important process to make sure that you create a good dynamic character with some good dynamic poses. And by doing it in the technique of using silhouettes, you do not waste any time putting in details, putting in light to dark and fleshing stuff out, only to find that your character does not stand out from the rest of them, which is so important in animation in games, because you want each character to be identified, whether you see them in the distance or whether you see them literally as a silhouette. They need to have enough characteristics that will stand them alone from the rest. And it is a key to the design project, and it's quite quick and simple to do once you get the hang of it, and allows for a lot of variation. Once you've done your fully rendered aspects, you could create poses for them that are going to be typical for those characters to really emphasize who they are, as we can see in this image here. And of course, just the model sheet pose, and here we've got a character lineup showing all of our characters lined up, so give an idea of height of each of those characters and also girth in some of them as well. So character sheets, model sheets, and also defining your characters like that. And here we can see a breakdown: initial silhouette, finalized design, add some color, add some values, make it look specky, and then we build our model sheet, and then finally all our rendering and coloring and texturing all comes in to build our final character. So if you are dealing with a client, if you're dealing with an art director, silhouettes are a great way to get that quick, rapid variation to our characters. So what we're going to jump into looking at, as well as this, is the techniques that go into making this. So this is all going to be done in Adobe Photoshop, and these are the basic process that we're going to look at. The main process, this is going to be three different variations to that. One is freehand, silhouette, direct creation. So we're actually going to create the entire thing as a silhouette directly. The other one is using a sketch or line drawing and then converting that to a silhouette image. So if you're doing something in pen or pencil and you're just doing line work, which a lot of people are very familiar with doing, you can take that and we're going to turn that into the silhouette base. And then finally, photo assets, taking actual photos of objects and potentially people and stuff like that, and turning them into a silhouette, and basically bashing it together and seeing what we can come up with. And of course, you can combine all three of these. So, you know, we really want to get a good strong silhouette, so this is the way. Following process, once we've done all this, is once we've defined our hero silhouette, is we're going to give it form by defining values in grayscales, light to dark, adding details, adding color, adding textures, and finally any finishing touches and presentation that we want to do to it. So first step, silhouette, get it looking good, get it looking identifiable, do a few variations of that, then we drag the ones that we want to use, do any final touch-ups, and then we take it through the process all the way to a final rendered finished character or vehicle or prop. So this section here, the initial one, is first thing we're going to do is set up our document. After that, freehand, silhouette, direct creation. So we're going to look at setting up our brushes and being aware of transparency, which is quite important. Straight lines and blobs, how to do straight lines, how to do blobs, creating lasso and shapes, erasing in negative space, transform, flip, and mash, always fun. And also being aware of smart objects and scaling for later use, so we can always shrink things down and bring them back up again. Second part is sketching or line drawing to silhouette, taking an existing or creating a line drawing and then making sure that it follows the silhouette technique. And we're going to be using blocking and using lasso tool versus quick selection and wand tools, and why we want to use certain tools over other for that. Blending and merging or grouping those, so you can actually use them as a flattening layer with the line work or without the line work as you go. And then the third technique is using photo assets all the way to silhouettes. So selecting photos, cutting out deep etching techniques, color filling, bashing together all the rest of it. So there they are. All of them have their significance, all of them are useful. Once we've actually done that and we've set up our basic silhouette that we want to use, depending on which technique you want to apply for that, we'll then take it to the next level, which is adding values, adding colors, adding textures, and finishing touches. So enjoy it. Let's carry on with that. Let's jump to it. First of all, let's start up a new document. We've got Photoshop here, and when you first have this screen here, obviously you've got the option for creating new right around here, but I'm going to just jump into File, New. I'm going to set this to print resolution A4, and just for the orientation on my screen, I'm going to set that to landscape and just hit create. And remember, if you don't want to go too big with these, otherwise you might start slowing down your processor and stuff like that, and you don't want them too small because you want to get a little bit of detail. Alright, nice white little bit of paper here. Rule number 1, do not draw in your background layer. You want to make sure that when you're drawing it isn't a transparent layer or blank layer, so you can move it around, and it is going to be crucial for creating silhouettes in this. Once again, make sure you also clean up your workspace. At this point, the only thing we really need is layers. If you have other things on like learning and all the rest of it, anything that you're not going to be using, just minimize that by going to window and unticking. And as you can see, I've just got the layers panel here. Awesome. I'm going to start by creating a new blank layer. Just going to the little plus sign down here. You could also go to layer, new, and go to layer or shift command or control N. But little plus sign down here doesn't ask no questions and should be ready for us to go. So we're going to start off with just doing some rapid prototyping and just throwing some shapes around, and I'm going to show you the basics of doing that and some of the reasons why we use certain tools over the others. So first of all, our main thing just for drawing is going to be our brush tool. So I'm going to go B for brush, and you can find it over here in our layers panel. Now up the top here in our options bar, we have a few different options that we can deal with. The one here with the little circle here, this is going to be our basic brushes, and when you first open this, unless Photoshop's changed it, which they will on occasions, you'll see general brushes, dry, wet media, special effects brushes, and realistically the one that's going to be a big savior for us when we're first setting up silhouettes is the hard round and hard round pressure size. Now as far as the pressure size here, you can select just a simple hard round brush, step out of there, and you can activate using this default little toggle here. Always use pressure for size. When off, brush preset controls pressure, and your brush presets are in this little toolbox here. As you can see, this little button here will bring that up, and I can actually go and see the different presets that are on that brush and turn them on or off. So I can turn on shape dynamics, for example, size jitter. I can actually turn that to pen pressure and have that as a default. So that's the option there, but this is the regular brush, so I'm just going to rely on that. And just to give you a quick idea of that, got my default colors. I've just got black. There is a straight line, not very exciting, but once I turn on pressure for size, you can see I can actually adjust that size depending on how hard I press on the brush. Okay, Command Z to step backwards there. Now there is a reason why I'm suggesting that we use these two brushes as opposed to pressure for opacity and flow, and also these soft round brushes, and that is because we're going to be using clipping masks, and clipping masks will allow you to draw on top of your silhouette, but it'll also take in transparency information. And to give you an idea of sort of what's going on with that, I'm actually just going to show you by drawing some stuff with something like a hard round pressure and opacity, and let's see what that is. By the way, I'm adjusting my brush here by using these square brackets on my keyboard next to the letter P, and that'll give you a nice little plus and minus. If you are working on a Wacom, a newer version Wacom, I think you can actually press either the command or control. the lower button on your mouse, on your Wacom pen, press both of those at the same time, and then you should be able to click and drag and adjust your brush size. Mine doesn't actually have that. I've got a little slide panel that I've programmed in, so I can do that off to the side. But for the most part, I'm just going to be using these square brackets here. Don't forget, you can actually access this by going to your pen option, brush options here, and you've got the size slider there. But to be honest with you, it's pretty bad because you can't actually see your brush size until you move your brush off the screen. So there's a lot of kicking backwards and forwards for that. And of course, if you cannot see your brush shape, like this little circle here, if you see that instead, a little target, that may be because your caps lock is on. So it does happen. Just keep an eye out for it if you do see it. Anyway, but let's get back to it. So once again, I'm just pushing my lower mouse or lower button on my Wacom pen here, and that will also bring up my options panel for my different brushes. So soft, round, pressure, opacity. Let's get a nice chunky brush for this, and I'm going to start just drawing in some lines here. And because it is soft, round for opacity, the harder I press, the darker it is. Now, just really quickly, hopefully some of you can notice, and I'm just going to go Z for zoom. I'm just going to zoom into this little section here, space bar to move around. Hopefully you might be able to notice this little sort of caterpillar style effect that's popping here. That will happen. It's kind of a RAM saving situation that happens in Photoshop, and that can actually be fixed by going to this little toolbox here. Once again, this is our brush settings here, and it's kind of hidden up the top here. It's brush tip shape. If you click on that, and what we're looking at here is the spacing right at the bottom. As you can see, the spacing for this one is currently set to 25%. If I increase that, you can see that these little dots are going to get further and further apart. So if you do want them really close together, if you want to get a nice smooth line, do drop that down lower, but it can affect your processing stuff. But you know, I like to have a nice smooth brush if it's supposed to be. There we go. We can see sort of that variation. I think I may have selected a different brush. Yes, for brand pressure size. Let's turn that opacity one on. Now you can see I'm just drawing some weird shapes and stuff like that. And this all looks really good. And it's, you know, it may seem like a good idea to paint in this way, but we want to get a really good solid background. And I'm going to show you the reason. I'm just going to create a layer below. And in this case, I'm going to switch out my black for something like red. And let's just make a solid line with this. So, and I'm just going to draw a straight line underneath. So this is on the underneath layer, and just a nice straight line. And what you should be able to see is there are some areas that are dark where I've pressed really hard, that you're not going to see that red line coming through. But these other areas are essentially transparent, and you know, you can see that through. So if I move these lines around, you can see wherever I move them, they're going to have a transparency on them. So ideally, if this was going to be a face or a figure or something like that, we wouldn't want to be able to see through it. So if you've got a background or something, that's something we want to try and avoid. So we want to stick with brushes that are a solid brush, and also preferably, unless it's something that you really think that you do need, ones that don't have a blurry edge to them, because that's going to get blurry and more transparent as we head out. So it is something just to keep an eye on. So I'm going to trash those, and I've just duplicated it. Instead of trashing them, let's drag them in there. You can hit delete as well, and I'm going to start again, making sure I don't paint on my background. Alright, so the two brushes I recommend, I'm going to get back to my default colors here. I'm just going to hit D for default. There's black and there's white. By the way, you can switch these over. This is your foreground and background color. You can just push this little arrow here, or the shortcut is X, so kind of like a little X shape to swap them over. There's a nice little shortcut there, and you can load up your primary and secondary colors that way. It's pretty cool. Alright, B for brush, I'm going to right click on my Wacom pen, or you can go to your option up the top here, and I'm going to basically play around with either the hard brush or the hard round pressure size, and of course you can toggle that off. I really want to make sure opacity is 100% and that I don't have pen pressure turned on for opacity for those. So I'm going to get a nice little solid line for that. And once again, don't forget to use those square brackets to adjust the overall size of your brush, like so. Alright, once again, I'm going to be deleting a lot of layers as I'm sort of going through this. Let's talk some real basic techniques for this. So obviously if you push down really hard, you're going to get a rather large size depending on the size of your brush. So I usually recommend, just to throw down some shapes, you could just hit a few little circles, adjust the size, bring it back down again, and all that kind of stuff. And you can maybe come up with some funky shapes depending on what your project is. Nice little organic shapes. The other technique, as far as really sort of doing this, is obviously painting and being aware of your brush size and using that pressure for opacity to start figuring out some funky things. And we just want to get an overall block of the shape, and we can always fix it up a little bit later. And I usually recommend just throwing stuff down and seeing what happens as you're doing it. Now, another couple of tools that I'm going to recommend using is your Shift key. Now, your Shift key is going to be your friend for drawing straight lines. Now, what I'm going to do is, as you can see, I'm still just hovering at the moment. I'm not actually pressing at the moment. I'm going to press the Shift key on my keyboard, and then when I actually start drawing, if I drag it left to right, it will do a perfect horizontal line. If I drag it, I'm going to take my finger off the Shift key, I'm going to press Shift again, and I'm going to click, sorry, I'm just going to have to start again. I'm going to click and then press Shift and then drag upwards. It will give me a perfect vertical line. Now, it does take a little bit of getting used to, but pressing Shift and dragging and then pressing Shift, either way, it will get you straight horizontal and vertical lines. There is another technique for the Shift key, and this involves you placing a point to start with. I'm just going to put an X, but it's going to go from the last position of that X, which I think is down the bottom here. Then I'm going to move my my pen to a different location. I'm going to press the Shift key down now, and then I'm just going to tap where I want it to go. And that will draw a straight line from the last position to the place that I tapped. So move the pen, keep your finger on the Shift key, and then tap to the next place, tap to the next place, and as you can see, that is going to allow me to do a bunch of straight lines. And this may look like a modern masterpiece, but there are a few little things I just want to point out with this. So the first thing is I'm going to do that point, click, Shift, tap, and I'm going to do a few others, and hopefully what you can see is that my line thickness is varying quite a lot between these points. And essentially all that's happening here is, because the pressure for size is on, it is adjusting the line from the first point to the second point to the third point, depending on how much pressure I put in the first place and how much pressure is at the second point. So that's going to do that. If you don't want that, if you want a perfect straight line without that variation, you can either, if you do have the toggle on for pressure size, do turn that off, or make sure you go to your brush and select one that doesn't have that as an option and make sure it's off, or thirdly, go into your brush settings and make sure you turn anything that has shape dynamics. For example, let's go hard round pressure size. Let's go to our brush settings here, shape dynamics. You can see that the size jitter is set to pen pressure, and you can turn that to off, or you can untick it right there. I'm going to leave that because I kind of like it, and I can just go between my round brush and hard round brush. Now, of course, these aren't the only brushes you can use, but the big one you want to think about is trying to avoid any transparency in there. Alright, back to a new layer. Remember, please try to avoid painting in that background. Now, I'm actually going to make a suggestion with the background while I'm saying don't paint in the background. By default, it is actually locked, but you can still paint in it. I'm going to suggest dropping in a light grey color. So if you open up your color picker here, and just pick out a nice little light grey color, go to your paint bucket. So shortcut for paint bucket is G. By default, it is actually the gradient, and you can try and put the gradient in if you want, but I'm just going to go click and hold and then go to the paint bucket. You can get that by going Shift B until you get the bucket, and I'm just going to drop in a slight grey colour for the background and then click on my new layer. Now the reason for that is this might actually fox some people, is that they might, instead of erasing, they might switch over to white brush and actually start painting instead of erasing, and that's really not what we want. What we want later on, that's going to mess up our stuff for a few steps. So the grey just means we can notice if we accidentally start painting in with white. Alright, blank layer, brush, I'm going to hit D for default once again to get my black brush here. I've got my hard round pressure size, and I'm just going to throw some shapes down and see what happens. So this technique is just me throwing down some stuff and hoping for the best, and you know, I'm relying on that pressure for size. I can kind of see something forming already, and if you're unsure of what it is, rotate it, transform it, do some funky stuff like that. So you can switch to your move tool. If you do like having show the transformation controls on, they will be there as a default. So move tool V, and this will allow you to rotate potentially, and you go, oh, there's something else there, or move around. And again, if you right click, you can also flip your object vertically, horizontally, and if you want to distort as well, you can unlink the little link between the width and the height here, or if you press Shift, that will also allow you to override that as well. So if you've got that turned off, it will automatically allow you to stretch, and press Shift, it will distort, constrain. If you've got that linked, then it will do the opposite. Shift will now allow you to distort. So now move stuff around, stretch and bend and do all the rest of it. See if you come up with anything that's going to work for you. So I'm just going to kick that around. I actually think I saw something in the first one. It's not that exciting. I actually don't like having the transformation controls. Some people love it. I actually don't like seeing a bounding box around things. I'm going to turn that off. You can just press Command or Control T to access your transformation options there. So I'm just going to start pushing some stuff around. You can kind of see some stuff popping in here. And I'm really not going to spend too much time doing any of this, because I really just want to get to the technique side of it, and I'm going to try to just get some real basic sort of things going here. Now the big thing with silhouettes is just getting that as a solid shape, and you know, rather than doing a sketch form, which I will talk about in a bit anyway, but this technique, you know, just rely on that randomness almost to see what you come up with, and you might be able to find something really cool by accident almost. Alright, I'm just going to switch to my eraser tool, so E for eraser. Please remember your eraser has the same brush options as your brush basically. So I'm going to turn my eraser to hard round pressure size, and I'm just going to use that to start building up some negative space, cutting back at it, if you will, until I can start getting something funky. Don't be shy to adjust your brush size. If it's getting too big or too small, you can start adjusting that sort of stuff up, and just, you know, seeing what works for you until you start getting, you know, the right thing, and then switch between your brush and add some extra stuff and all that kind of stuff. Now I usually recommend just, you know, get a real basic form first, and you know, before you get too carried away with the details, store it away. So I'm going to store this away. I'm going to do one more just to give you an idea, and then I'm going to show you a couple other cool tricks. So this is my canvas here. I'm going to zoom out so you can see the whole canvas here. It's a pretty big fish. This is an A4 canvas. It's looking kind of like a fish now, so I'm calling it a fish, and I want to actually push this off to the side and use it as a reference. But crucially, I'm going to run into a bit of drama, and I'm going to show you what I mean. I'm going to increase my canvas size to maximum. I'm going to hit Command 0 so it fills the whole screen. I'm going to transform this guy down, so I'm going to go Command T. I've got my width and height linked, so I don't have to worry about stretching, and I'm going to shrink him down and pop him in the corner and press return. Now if at a later point I go, oh yeah, that's that little fish dude that I kind of liked, I'm going to hit Command T to transform. I'm going to scale him back up again, and hopefully some of you can already see what the issue is. We're starting to get some pixelation. Depending on your settings in Photoshop, it will try and fix that, but what you're actually going to end up with is rather a blurred edge, and you can kind of see that edge is getting a little bit blurred there, and it kind of destroys the purpose of having that hard edge. So unfortunately for us, I'm going to step back. Unfortunately for us, what we want to do is, before we shrink this guy down, if we kind of like our silhouette, we're going to convert it to a smart object. So here's my layer here. I'm going to right click and go to convert to smart object. You'll notice this little icon in the corner telling me that it is a smart object, and now what I can do is transform. You'll notice there's a different bounding box around that. Shrink him down to whatever size I want, apply that, and when it comes to bringing him back again, Control T, stretch him out again, he'll actually maintain the same quality as he was when he was originally created, because it is a smart object. The downside, I don't want to say a downside to it, it's just going to take a little bit more effort for us, is that we can't actually draw on him now. If I go B for brush and try to draw on him, it's going to yell at me saying it has to be rasterized. Thanks for the tip, Photoshop. So I'm going to hit cancel. So if you do want to redraw and fix him up, get him to a decent size again, right click and go to rasterize layer. That little icon will disappear, and now you can redraw. So it is destructive now. You can erase and draw and do whatever you want with him right there. And I feel he just needs a little bit of a tail fin sort of thing. Alright, so once again, just to show you how quickly, convert to smart object, transform. I'm going to dump him in the corner. Sorry, I'm so used to pressing the shift key. When I'm transforming, because it used to be by default the link was not on. Alright, so one layer for each character or object or weapon or whatever it is that you're creating. Let's look at a few other tools. So your brush tool's a great one. Using the shift key is a brush one. The other things you've also got at your disposal are things like using the shape tools or lasso tools. So things like using rectangular tools like so, and paint bucket G for filling in, or you can go back to your brush tool as well. So that's there as well. If you jump into your lasso tools, L for lasso, you've got your freeform lasso tool and your polygonal lasso tool. Magnetic lasso tool is not going to be much use to us. I don't find it much use for much at all. But do select that. I'm going to leave anti-aliased off and make sure my feather is set to 0. Let's deselect that. Command D or Control D to deselect. You can also access that by going to select and deselect. You can see the shortcut there, but I've already deselected. So if you do want to use the lasso tool, what you can do is you can just create some shapes, hit the paint bucket, fill it in, deselect, or you can just start a new shape. So let's do some freeform lasso tool stuff. I have no idea what I'm creating. If you want to just continue before filling that in, you can press shift. That will bring up the add option, and if you want to subtract from that, alt will allow you to subtract from that, and then you can jump in with your paint bucket and hopefully start filling that in, and of course deselect, Command D once that's done, and you can just start throwing. I'm going to switch to my brush. I find it a little bit more organic to start with, and you can start coming in with some really cool funky shapes as required for that. Now there are obviously a few other tools in here. If you really want to get fun and technical, you can use things like your shape tools down here and your brush tool, but there are I just find there's a few extra steps that I usually don't want to deal with when I'm trying to do some sort of rapid prototyping, and I'll just sort of click them through quite quickly and fill them in as required. Now please note as well, sometimes you will get this sort of, I don't know if you can see it, but this very light line here when you're filling in. You may need to step back and just give it another click with the bucket just to make sure you don't have any gaps, because that's really going to be sort of the thing you want to avoid with doing that. But anyway, that's kind of the core thing, is just sort of using those shapes and pushing them around. And I really haven't created anything too exciting here, but as I said, this is more of a demo sort of thing. So I'm just going to dump this one as well. I'm going to convert it to Smart Object in case I ever want to use whatever the hell it is later, and then drop that in. Now if you do get funky and you want to use a combination of shapes, you can still merge them together and use them, but I'm going to do one more. Let me see if I can think of something fairly simple that's going to be effective for me to actually create. I might do like a little insect sort of dude. Everybody loves insects, right? And let's just create some little wings for him. And I'm really trying to make sure that I've sort of fill out the solid areas for this. I don't really want to have any blank areas, and I've just got my finger on those little square brackets, so that as I change them, as I change the brush size, and then of course my shift key, I'm going to do some nice little legs on this dude, something like that. So you can really get some real fine lines when you are, if you are creating for like a little, you know, hairs and stuff like that, and they will all be transferable. Let's give them a little stinger once we start going into the next steps, which is sort of filling out your areas and all the rest of it. It's got these little, pretty tiny little wings, but that's all right. Let's fill that in. Alright. Definitely not my finest work, but in a pinch we can kind of see what's going on. Might give them some sort of thicker legs, maybe some kneecaps, insects, bees' knees. Alright, that'll kind of do. Actually, let's get on. Every time I say that'll do, I'm like, oh, I'll just add a little bit more, but okay. So you know, let's have a look at some more manipulation options with this guy. I'm actually going to turn off the other ones because they're kind of in the way now, and I'm going to do a few variations of this just to show you some of the tools that we can actually access. So this is my little mosquito dude. I just want to make sure there's really no little small gaps in there at the moment. And one of the things you can obviously do is grab your eraser and start digging forwards and backwards. If you do want to get like really good curves, you can use things like the elliptical tool or the pen tool. And you know, one of the things that a lot of people don't actually realize is you can create an ellipse, for example, and if you don't like the rotation of it, you can actually right click in there and go transform selection, and this will actually allow you to rotate and move that selected area as opposed to the entire shape. I've just stepped out of it, unfortunately, one of the downsides of using a tablet. And you can also right click here and go to things like distort, and you can grab the corners and you can really start, you know, getting some finicky shapes with that. I should zoom in on that so you can see it a bit closer. And you know, you can get some nice little curvature to that if you want to get some things with perfect curvature. Once you're happy with that, just apply it. You can either hit tick to enter or cross to cancel, and that will give you back your selected area. And then you could paint in there, or if I want to erase from there, I can inverse it by going to select, inverse, or Shift+CTRL+I, and then grab my eraser, and as you can see, I can just choose to sort of cut back into that part there if I wanted to, and then deselect. So there's a bunch of ways there. I can just notice there's a whole lot of holes in here, but you know, I can actually fix those later. I'll talk about that at another point. Alright, I gotta step away from the details sometimes, guys. I get too carried away. Alright, so I'm going to do a variation of this guy. I'm going to copy him. So here he is here. He's a nice big size, so I don't need to convert him to a smart object to shrink him down. And I'm going to grab my move tool. So duplicating this layer, there's a heap of ways of doing it. There he is there. One is to right click and go to duplicate layer. The other one is to drag that all the way down to your plus little square with a plus in your layers panel. The other one is to go to layer, duplicate layer. One of my favorite ways of doing this is with your move tool selected, V. If you press the Alt key, as you can see I'm pressing the Alt key right now, the black arrow now gets a little white arrow underneath it, and what that allows me to do is actually just drag that out, and I've got a duplicate of that layer. So there he is there. We've got layer 1, layer 2 of our little mosquito insect dude. Cool. So I can, clean this up. I can do all that kind of stuff. One of the other cool things you can do is you can also make some basic changes to this. So I could do things like grab the, I'm just going to use the poly lasso tool in this case, and I can select around, this part of the leg, for example. Let's zoom in so hopefully we can see a little bit better. And I'm going to go and transform. I'm going to go Command T to transform, Control T if you're on a PC. I'm going to move the pivot point of this. There's my pivot point, and you can actually move it outside of the leg, and that's going to allow me to move that leg around and even shift the whole thing if I need to. So that pivot point is going to define where that rotation is. If you're happy with that, I'm actually not massively happy with it, but demo, you can obviously deselect that, and once you've applied the transformation. So that's one option there. I'm going to show you another one. So you could basically you could select that whole wing, transform, move that pivot point, and rotate and all the rest of it, and expand and do all that kind of stuff. The other thing you can do as well is distort this. So once you've got the areas selected that you want to play around with, I've accidentally stepped out of the transformation. Let's select again, transform. Once you're happy with sort of where it is and you want to do some extra stuff, you can right click in there and you can go to stuff like distort, which means you can grab each of these corners and do some funky stuff there. The other one that's kind of fun is right click and go to warp. Now this has actually changed over the last few years. It used to have an initial grid pattern, but what you can basically do is just click in here and start warping this around, and if you can actually create some grids in there as well. There's a 3x3, and you can grab these little extra points inside and start moving them and do some real funky stuff, but most of the time I'll just do it freehand without the grid, and of course apply and then Command D to step out. So warping's great, especially for organic stuff, and you can also do it for non-organic stuff as well. Another one I want to show you is another transformation, but in order to do it you actually have to go into edit and find it here. So it's not actually attached to the standard transformation where you can just go free transform and then right click, and or going down to transform, you can see it here. But if you go to puppet warp, it is a specialized one, and once again the default is going to set up a little grid or mesh I should say, and you can play around with the layout for that. You can do an expansion, which essentially means it's going to expand the grid out beyond the image. It is important that you do have your image cut out. If your image is drawn on a white canvas, for example, your grid will be based on the entire canvas. This is one of the reasons why we need to make sure we use individual layers for these. And then once you sort of see that mesh, I usually turn off the show mesh thing because I can see my object anyway, and you can start actually putting puppet pins in. As you can see, I'm just dropping some in here and popping in just on a few little main points. So if you are doing a character, typically what you want to do to take full advantage of this is you want to make sure that the limbs are far enough away that you can actually take advantage. Otherwise what you're going to get is it's going to start stretching unwanted components. So this one's kind of cool. Let's do one for this little proboscis thing. It's going to get a little bit funky if it gets confused, if it's too far away from something, as this one does. even though that little jaggedy thing's kind of cool. And we can start moving this stuff around and really playing with our character and their shape. Let's bring that one back down. If you don't like it, you can actually right click and delete that pin. If we wanted to get more complex, we can actually move some pins in front of others and all that kind of stuff as well, but we're dealing with a silhouette here, so at this point it really doesn't matter as far as the pin depth goes. And when you're happy, apply or cancel, and there we have it. We've got a nice little variation to our character. It might put a little bit more dynamism in there, but ready to rock and roll. Alright, what I'm going to show you guys next is actually the next thing, which is where we start giving our characters a little bit of form using values. So let's go and check that one out. Into anything like adding values, color, textures, that kind of stuff, I do want to show you a few other techniques for creating our base for silhouettes. And one is actually using line drawings. So this could be anything from pencil drawings to sketches, or even if you've just hand drawn something, it just happens to be a bunch of lines in Photoshop or whatever other program that you are using. And I've got one here. It's a very rudimentary sketch. I'm going to drop this into Photoshop, and I'm just going to apply that. Now if you do drag and drop directly into Photoshop, by default it is going to be a smart object. You can identify that, which means I can't paint on it or draw on it. Now I'm actually only interested in one small section of this, just more of as a demo sort of thing, and it's kind of like this horse head sort of situation over here. So at this point I'm actually okay with the resolution and size of that, so I am going to cut the rest of that out. You can use masking techniques if you want, but I'm going to be quite destructive with this, so I'm going to right click on this guy and rasterize him, and I'm going to just do a really quick cutout of this guy, and then show you how to apply this. So there's a wealth of tools for this, including quick selection, but it's kind of a fairly rough drawing, so it's going to have a lot of lines and stuff that I might not really want, but I'm just going to do this in a way that's just going to isolate from the rest of the scruffy stuff that I've got. So I've just done a really quick selection there, and a couple of ways that we can do this is we can copy and paste this selection from this layer and we'll get a blank of that, separate from what's existing, or the other thing you could do is inverse the selection and delete it, or you can go press Command J. Now Command J is kind of like copy and paste, except it's copy and paste in place. I really do recommend J for jump. Get used to that, so I'm going to hit that right now, and as you can see it's done a copy and paste, and it's exactly the same place. So once you start using Command J, you probably use it more than Command C, Command V for copy and paste. And I'm just going to delete that other one. I'm only interested in this little sketch right here. Now this by itself is really not going to help me out for that much for doing our silhouette technique, and I really need to make sure that it's quite solid in the areas that I want to add shading and color and texture and stuff like that. So I kind of want to paint over this, to be honest with you, but the other way of painting over it would also be just using a lasso tool. So I'm going to show you both techniques, and you can kind of make your decision where you want to go for that. The downside with this is it's kind of got a different color bit of paper, and if I want to keep the drawing side of it, I really will need to sort of cut it out properly. But let's jump into it. I'm going to create a new layer and just make sure it's below. Let's rename this drawing like so, and I've got a layer below that I'm going to start just using a solid brush to start filling in the areas of the drawing. Now if I do go B for brush and I grab something like hard round pressure size, just like we did before, and start painting, you'll notice that I can't actually see below the drawing. Now what we're going to do to sort of fix this is we're going to change the blend mode of the drawing layer from normal to multiply, and that's actually going to allow us to see through the lighter areas of our drawing. So in most cases our drawing is going to be that. If it's something like the opposite, you may have to use something around here, around lighten, but in the meantime normal is going to be perfect for that. This little squiggle layer is not going to do much for me. Again, that's just a demo now, so I'm going to create another blank layer below. So remember, the layer that you want to use this to just start blocking in or creating a flatting layer needs to be below the drawing layer, like so, and the drawing layer needs to be set to multiply. If you really want to get flash, do lock your drawing layer so you don't accidentally draw on it just by accident, and then select here. Now I'm not going to use black, it's very destructive. I'm not going to be able to see my lines, so you may wish to select a different color. Now that could be as simple as going a light gray color, but I would almost be tempted to get something that's going to be sticking out, like a red or a green or something like that. You can always change the color later, and what you want to do is you just want to make sure that you are getting the basic shapes of this. Now you could use the shift technique, which is basically jumping from point to point, or if you're a dab hand, a freehand, you know, that could work as well. And you want to make sure you get a decent outline only of the stuff that you want to be able to recreate. So you're more than welcome to keep your line work, but anything that you want to actually shade in or add texture or anything like that needs to have a solid surface to work on. And I really don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm probably not going to actually use it. But you know, let's try and do a little bit of a reasonable job. I'm just going to use the shift key for those little aspects there, whatever they are, and let's do that little fill in there. I should use a proper circle for that. Alright, once I've got that sort of real base thing, I know it's pretty much looks like a closed shape. I'm going to switch to my paint bucket tool and just drop a solid color in there. Give it a couple of clicks so it gets that proper line, and you know. So I've got this set to continuous or contiguous. I've got all layers turned off, so it's only going to stop when it reaches a border, and it's only going to take into consideration this layer that I am currently filling in. Cool. So what I can do now is I could continue adding detail to this layer here, and it's just a solid sort of reddish color. If I turn off the drawing, you can see that's pretty much what we're looking at, is just a red silhouette. Now if you're really cool with that, and you know, you go, oh, I've got all the details and all the rest of it, there are a couple of things you can do to get rid of this excess. I'm just going to change the color so I can just do some notes for you. There's excess areas that you may not want. If you want to keep your line work that you've already sketched in, a couple of ways I'm going to recommend of doing that. One is to go to this layer, the drawing layer, and then just manually erase them, which could take you quite a bit of time. The other one is if you press Command or Control and actually click in this silhouette layer that we've created for our drawing. So if you notice, as I hover over there, as I press Command or Control on a PC, a little square appears below the hand. If I click on there, that will select everything that is in this layer. And you can see the marching ants around that right there. Now with that selected, because that's all that's in there, what I can do now is go to the drawing layer. Please note I have unlocked it now, and add a mask. So it's got that selection, and I'm going to go to the little mask icon. It is in your layers panel, and it looks like a rectangle with a circle in it, and that will hide everything outside of that selection. Now please note, the cool thing with masks is your image is not destroyed. If I right click on the mask, I can disable it. You can see all that drawings in there, and in mask world anything that's black is invisible, as you can see there, and anything white is still going to be visible. So if I do decide I need some extra detail from my original drawing, I can grab my brush. Make sure you select it on the mask, not the drawing. Hopefully you can see that I'm selecting the mask there. Black is going to be invisible, so I could potentially start hacking away at that. And if I switch over to white, I can actually start eating back into that as well. But I'm fairly happy with that. Both the pencil work, and if you want, you can do things like make sure you select it back onto the layer, adjust the levels, image adjust levels, and you can potentially start pushing the levels up and down if you wanted to play with that, and even the opacity, because it's not actually going to be our main reference point for that. Alright, so we've actually created a silhouette for that, but if you want to use your line work, you can still keep it. I'm going to show you guys how to take advantage of that in just a moment. So I'm actually going to dump these guys into a group folder. I'm going to shift select both of those, go to my little folder icon here, and let's just tap create a new group. Wacom's struggling to get to that one, and let's call this horse, just so I can find it. And I'm going to right click and just give it a color as well. Actually, let's make it sort of that reddish color, like so. So I can find that at a later point with both the line work and the mask. Even if the mask is in red, it really doesn't matter at this point. Alright, the next technique that I want to show you for creating silhouettes is akin to photo bashing, and I've essentially grabbed a few images over here. My monitor's changed its stuff recently, and these are just images I've grabbed off the internet. I'm being fairly lazy with a lot of these. I am looking specifically for ones that are going to be easy to depatch or cut out, and if you're really clever, you can sometimes just bypass cutting them out altogether and get images with an alpha on them as well. So there's a few interesting ones in here, including a character that I could potentially repose. I really do like this whippet dog. I don't know how easy he's going to, sorry, it's a greyhound, how easy it's going to be to cut out, but let's give it a red hot go. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to build silhouettes from a bunch of different stuff. So I'm going to bring back my Photoshop document, and I'm going to drop this guy in here. Now I have dropped him in. Here's a smart object. You can tell by that because I've dragged and dropped. The other way of doing this would be, let's jump back into that folder, is to right click and go to, is that what it's called? Yep, okay, copy, and then Command V and paste. So right click, copy, and then Command V, paste, and this will give you a raster layer. But once again, it's easy enough to just rasterize or convert to smart objects, either way, just by going right click, rasterize layer. Alright, now I'm going to do see if I can cut out the background of this guy. Once again, you could use your lasso tools, you could use all that kind of stuff. You can also try playing around with object selection tool. So the shortcut for these are W. This is relatively new to Photoshop, object selection tool, and literally all you need to do is drag over the object, give it a few seconds, and you might actually get a reasonable result. Don't forget to zoom in and just check. As you can see, it's missed a few areas here. The object selection tool, you can switch between rectangle and lasso, and once again, Shift, press cap lock accident, Shift will allow you to add. So I could potentially just loop a bit around there and see if it fixes it up a bit. It's going to struggle because there's not much contrast. I love the image, just that contrast between the background is going to be a little bit of a detriment for my liking. But you know, let's give it a go, see what we can get. Most of it's actually not too bad. So if that still messes up, we can switch to our manual lasso tools and zoom in and press Shift to add, and you can manually start painting this sort of stuff in. Other options that I'm actually going to deselect, that's not too bad. The other options are wand tool, quick selection tool, and quick selection tool, you want to start sort of in the middle of the object you want to select and then start dragging out. And if the contrast is good, as you can see I'm just doing it stroke by stroke, if the contrast is good it should work fairly well. This one's a bit dubious because that background is a little bit close in color and value to the image. If you're doing, that's why most of them I try to get a good contrast in the background, but you kind of get the idea here as you drag out. Now if it does go too far, which I'm actually surprised how well this one's working at the moment, kudos to the algorithm, but if you do drag out too far or the contrast is too much and we this bit sort of, pardon the pun, but dog-legged out, ideally the way to resolve this is not to step backwards and go Command Z or Control Z, is to actually press the Alt button, and it's a bit hard to see because my brush for this is quite small, but Alt will turn it from an additional to a subtractional, and you can start dragging that back. Now theoretically what actually happens is that Photoshop is supposed to sort of learn from this and go, okay, well that's, I'm figuring out what you do and don't want from that, and it's apparently gets more and more intelligent into what it does and doesn't want. And I've gone a little nuts with that part there, so it's struggling there still. Let's see if we can do the negative thing. Okay, it's kind of worked there, cool. And we want to get a reasonable selection of that. So the big ones for that is you could do this manually with the lasso tool, or object selection tool if it's obvious, quick selection tool, magic wand if the background is completely one color could work, and don't forget you can inverse select all of this. Now I do want to show you like the proper way of doing this if you really want a really good cutout. I'm going to be fairly brief with it, we can go into a lot of detail with this, but if I simply press delete, it's going to delete the dog. If I inverse the selection, you can go select, inverse, or SHIFT+CTRL+I. Try and remember that as a shortcut, and then press delete. It will delete the background, bearing in mind that this is no longer a smart object, which you cannot delete. However, if it was a smart object, we still have an option, and that option is to press the mask button. So here's a little mask button, and anything outside of the selection, which I actually just need to check that, yep, I've actually got the outside selected, so we inverse select that again, SHIFT+CTRL+I. So anything outside of your selection area will be hidden. So I'm going to hit the mask button, boom, the outside of that is hidden. Now there's my mask. If I really want to get finicky with this and get a really high detail, if you've got things like hair and stuff like that, double click into the mask, and this should enter into your mask mode, and in this you have some options like brushing, either positive or negative, just like we had before, and you can manually paint in there, but the one that I think is really fantastic is this one here. This, if we hover over it, this is our refine edge tool brush, and I'm going to zoom in here, and it works really quite amazing for things like hair and leaves, and you can actually brush in with that, and it'll start getting like tiny little follicles and stuff like that, but not fantastic for this image because it's quite a short haired dog, but do play around with that kind of stuff. I'm just going to hit OK with that, and there is my pooch. Now I actually don't want this pooch as as a pooch, I want it as a silhouette. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply that mask. Really going a long way around for this, but I'm going to right click on that, apply that layer mask, which means I can no longer keep editing that. It's going to basically cut that dog out, and what I want to do is turn that little puppy into a silhouette. Now there are numerous ways of doing this. One, which I've alluded to before, is if you hit Command or Control and click in the thumbnail, that will reselect this guy here. And what I could do theoretically is create a new layer with that still selected, go to my paint bucket, select the color I want, and drop that in there, and that will do a perfect silhouette fill of that, and I haven't destroyed the image below. So if that's something you want to do, fantastic. I'm going to show you another technique. Here's my puppy, and I'm actually not going to select him at all. I don't need to. I'm going to go to this little FX button down the bottom of your layers panel. So this is FX, and these are our layer styles, and I'm just going to go to color overlay, and this is going to add a color over the top of my pooch. Blend mode I'm going to set to normal, which I think it should be by default, I'm not sure, and color I'm going to set to black because that's what I'm doing for the silhouettes at the moment, and hit OK. And there's my little pooch here, and he's just as a silhouette. And of course, once you've done that, you could redraw onto him, or you could do on a separate layer, and you can also add other elements. So let's go a little bit berserk with this one, and I'm going to add one more thing to it. Let's see if I can find something that looks kind of cool. I usually get a few more than this. Alright, there's some nice stuff in this motorbike thing here, so let's grab that. Cool. Step out. Now I have dragged that back in there, so it is a smart object. I'm going to rasterize that straight away. Rasterize layer, and I'm going to try and quickly remove most of these parts that I don't actually need. I'm going to do it pretty rough. I'm going to go straight to my wand tool. To figure out which wand tools work best, whether it's quick selection or object selection, I'm just going to go, because it's got a nice white background here, I'm going to go sample the layers. Well, I actually don't really want to do that. I just want to sample this layer. Anti-aliased, I'm going to have that on. Basically allows for curvature and half pixels and that. And contiguous, I'm going to turn that, I'm going to leave that on. Off. So what that's going to allow me to do, if I click on this white area, you can see it's going to jump through to all of the white areas. If that's turned on and I select in this area, it's going to stop until it reaches the border. So I'm just going to do a really quick, quick dirty one. So contiguous. Tolerance, my tolerance is quite high at the moment, so it's allowing a lot of areas that aren't that perfect color. So if you lower the tolerance of that, I've got mine at 6, let's test that out. Alright, a bit low, let's ramp it up to 19. Alright, that's kind of getting there. We've got a little bit more of bleed popping through there. Still too much. Yeah, there's a lot of weird funky areas for that. But you know what, at this point, the other way of doing it would be to manually grab your lasso tool, and I want to unselect some of these areas potentially, or switch over to your poly lasso tool and let's subtract these as well. But I'm really not after precision at this point. This is just a demo. And let's continue that wand. I'm just going to hold down shift and I'm going to add these extra areas as well, and let's just delete them. So down and dirty, not really a cool cutout at all, and I'm not even going to bother. I'm just going to use the lasso tool to select this ground area and delete. I'm just super lazy at the moment. Alright, now this bike's kind of black anyway, but I'm going to add a FX, and let's go to color overlay. By default it's going to be black anyway now, and there it is there. And then what I'm going to just do is scale that down, and let's flip it, right click, flip horizontally, and let's see if I can get something funky happening with this pooch as far as like engine parts or something like that. We'll put like a weird motorbike thing popping on him. Don't forget to, if you want to scale and distort, you can. Cool, that's kind of working. Very weird. And also, let's do one final one just for my own personal amusement. This is one I put in before. hyena thing. Crocodile head, beautiful. This one here I'm going to copy and paste. So, actually, where is it? There, copy and Command V, paste. Let's scale that sucker up. Nice little white area there, so I'm just going to use the one tool and I'm just going to delete. I'm getting lazy. Let's transform him, let's flip him, let's right click, let's grab the right layer, that one there. There's the weird head. I'm going to go FX, let's go to color overlay, which is already default, and I'm just going to scale that up. See if I can add that on. Kind of defeats the purpose of putting the motorbike stuff on there, but there we go, that's kind of there. I'm just going to erase some of the motorbike bits and maybe scale some of it up. So we've got this weird hybrid vehicle, crocodile, something. Alright, so those are all the layers from there, and this is a really good technique for mashing together particularly like mechanical parts and stuff like that, which can be really tricky. And don't forget, you know, if you need to duplicate parts of that and scale them, if you need, do something else that's really kind of interesting, by all means go for it. It's like, pushing shapes around, and that's one of the big things with building silhouettes. It is about getting, those shapes and getting them to work for you. Before you sort of jump in and start adding all your weird colors and stuff like that. So I'm going to grab those guys, I'm going to shift select those, I'm going to drop them into a group folder, and let's call it Croc Dog, whatever you want to call it, and I'm going to right click and give that folder a color so I can easily find it as well. So I've got my Croc Dog, I've got my horse head, and I've also got my little zip bee. So those are kind of the three primary techniques for getting our base silhouettes, and what we're going to do next is we're going to jump into the final aspects of actually turning these from silhouettes to a finished product, which is adding value, adding texture, adding color, and adding final effects. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to look at creating some depth or form to our character, and we're going to be using values, so light to dark. And what I really do recommend for this is, stick to your grayscales to start with. Adding color early on can sometimes fox us with that. So if you remember from previous, we created Croc Dog. It's just a simple black silhouette. These are all in a group folder. Now, just to give you a quick idea of what we're going to be doing, is we're going to be using clipping masks. I've also got the horse one here. What you can actually do with the horse one, if you don't want it to be like a red silhouette, the red one was just for helping us see the difference between the grayscales there. If you want it to be like something like gray, if that helps you out, don't forget you can jump in and go to effects and go to color overlay, and rather than having it as black, choose maybe a light gray, like so, and that's going to change the color of that accordingly. So you can sort of see in real time what that's going to look like. Or if you want to get rid of your pencil marks altogether, then that's fine, or drop the opacity. So these are in a group folder, which means that I can still break this apart and this still should work. And I'm going to show you right now how it's going to work. I don't need that dog layer. So I'm on the Croco Dog or Croc Dog, and I'm going to create a blank layer above this. And just as a quick demo, I'm just going to quickly switch over, and I'm going to grab, let's grab, I don't know, something like a blue here, and I'm just going to draw a squiggly line. Let's change this brush over. Let's go for just hard round pressure size. Squiggly line, on this blank layer above here. And if we've got something like Croc Dog here, and he's got a lot of little tiny details to him, these little teeth and stuff like that, when I add my highlights and shadows and values and all the rest of the stuff that we're going to be doing, I really don't want to be concerned about going outside the lines with that. So what we're going to use is going to use clipping masks. So there's my layer with the squiggly lines. I'm going to right click on that and go to create clipping mask. And what that essentially means is that no matter where I paint, it's going to be clipped to that particular folder, which actually happens to have all of those layers in there. So I can continue painting and doing whatever, and it's always going to stick within that. Now there is a few little things to keep in mind. If I move that layer, that is going to break. So the clipping mask needs to be above that. So you just need to keep that in mind, that if you do move, your main silhouette layer around, that clipping mask is going to break, and you just need to move it back on top and right click and create clipping mask. The other thing to note is you can create multiple clipping masks. So I can create a new layer, create clipping mask, and that is also going to keep pushing down till it gets to, in this case, Croc Dog. So let's change the color up to show you what I mean, and let's add some spots and stuff, and all these spots are only going to show where Croc Dog is. So pretty awesome. So clipping mask is going to be the big one for us when we add our value and all the rest of it. Now I'm going to delete those because that's just a demo. I'm going to hide Croc Dog. I'm actually going to use one of these little bee characters. They're quite simple. I might use the secondary, the first one, and I'm just going to move him in position. Just for demo purposes, I'm just going to put him at the top, and let's give him a color. Let's make him yellow, and let's call him, I don't know, he's like a bee mosquito, but whatever. Let's call him B. Alright, new layer, right click, create clipping mask. Awesome. I'm going to go B for brush, I'm going to go D for default. I'm going to get my two primary colors, which are black and white. Now in clipping masks, unlike our actual silhouette, we can change our brushes. We can do some lovely soft brushes and stuff like that. Again, depends on your particular art style, but for me what I'm going to do is go for something like soft round pressure opacity. Nice. Select white, and I'm going to start brushing in where my shadows and highlights are. I usually lower my opacity overall. I don't usually run with 100% opacity until maybe later, but if you've got pressure the brush itself is soft round pressure opacity and flow that I had selected, which means the harder I press, the more ink or paint comes out, in this case white, but I usually drop that down anyway. I usually prefer building up in layers. And what you want to do is you want to get broad brush strokes now. So get yourself a nice big brush, and things you want to avoid is pure black and pure white. So as I start getting an idea for this, I'm actually going to start picking out, using the color picker, Alt, to start picking out grayer areas as opposed to pure black, and lighter areas, and start building those up. And if you really want to, you can go back to black if you've got a nice opacity, and once you get the hang of it, and just start thinking about light direction and how that's going to affect your character, and then just build up from there. As you get further and further into it, then you can start actually adding more and more details. So that little Alt key is going to bring up our color picker, and we can see it starts building up there. And if you don't want to get those harsh lines, remember, keep that opacity low. The manual numbers on your keypad will also allow you to adjust that. If I press 2, it's going to give me 20% and lower that opacity, so that's a real nice one. And I'm just going to kick this around a little bit and just start defining the shapes. Now, once again, I'm doing this fairly rapidly because it's just going to literally be a demo little character sort of thing, and we can start building up our little forms through there. As you start getting further and further into it, you may wish to start adding more details. So I'm going to switch between black and white here and just start manually painting in details as I feel fit. So I'm going to some little weird eyes and stuff like that. You know, don't be shy to adjust your opacity as required. I got mine really low at 20%, but as I said, I usually don't run it at 100% unless I'm absolutely sure of something, and we can start building that up through there. Now, one of the things I do see quite often is people will leave a lot of black from their original silhouette there. You know, you really want to think, what is your lightest point, what is your darkest point, and not have too much of either. You know, you don't want to have too much of pure white, you don't have too much of pure black. You want a nice variation in between, and you know, really do think about those little forms and stuff like that. Alright, so this guy's, I'm going to start getting carried away with this anyway, but let's look at a few other little techniques that I can recommend. So besides using our brush forms, and you can play around with all the different brushes in this, you know, you don't have to stick with hard round pressure opacity. You know, you can try some of the Kyle brushes, you can load up some legacy ones, you can play with, you know, oils for example, and you can get these lovely little oil shapes and stuff like that if you want to get little hair follicles and stuff like that. There's a wealth of different brushes and blends and all sort of stuff that are available, custom brushes, you name it. But we want to just really figure out that form of light to dark when we're doing this. One little thing just to keep in mind though is if you do switch to something like these wet media brushes, please note that when you do that, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, your brush will change from a regular brush, if that's what you had previously, to a mixer brush. So if you go to your brushes now, you just right click or lower click on that, and I'm going to switch back to you know, let's go hard round pressure size for example. It is going to be hard round pressure size, but it also is still going to have that wet mixer brush option to it now, so you've got more options there. So if that's not what you're chasing, it can get some really nice results from it though. You will need to re-click on that and make sure you switch back to your standard brush tool. So big tools for me for this are the Alt key to bring up my color picker so I can get the value that I want without having to completely going back to my colors here. If you do want to get back to default black and white, remember D for default, and you can start building that. Play around with your opacity as well as having that opacity on for pen pressure if that's the style that you want. Other things to kind of think of as well is that if you are after straight lines and that sort of thing, particularly if you're doing like machinery or mechs or something like that, you know, trying to keep a straight line here, obviously you've got your shift key option which will allow you to do some straight lines, but the other way of doing it is to use your lasso or even shape tools if you want. So I'm going to try and think of a good one for this. Let's focus in on this guy's eye. I'm going to zoom on his eye, and I'm going to use the elliptical tool in this case, and I'm just going to draw in where I want his eye. And if you want, don't forget you can transform that selection and do things like distort if you really want to play around with that selection. But I'm going to select the area there, and I'm going to go B for brush, and with that selected I can start shading that in, and it's going to make sure that I'm confined just to that area there that I currently have selected with that shape tool. So it's not going to stop me from escaping outside of the lines if that's going to be an issue. And of course once I've done that, if I want to do the opposite, I can go to select inverse or Shift+Command+I, and I can start painting on the inverse. So if I step out of that, you can see everything outside of that selected. And I'm going to go B for brush and default, and then I can, you know, maybe start thinking about how that eye socket's going to be affected with that eye in there, and you know, just start adding details to that, and that's going to stop me as well from, you know, painting in that selection. Of course, Command D to deselect, and you can see that kind of pops a little bit more there. And of course, use your lasso tools. So poly lasso tool, freeform lasso tool. If you need to draw some real funky little shapes and stuff like that, that could be one way of doing it. I'm just going to do a big lasso around there, and jump in there, brush, X to switch over between black and white. There we go, and you can see we're just sort of tapping a few little things there, and then of course inverse, Command Shift I, and then switch that to the darker colors, and we can drop that in there, and it's going to help us to sort of define that area as being darker from underneath, and of course Command D to deselect. And to blend all this back in, do try out some of the blender brushes. They can be pretty cool, but realistically there's an infinite amount of brushes that you could potentially use for this. Also, don't forget to adjust your brush sizes as you're going. Square brackets is one way of doing that. Of course, there will be others as well. Alright, so this guy's kind of, he's starting to take form, just purely from a demo point of view, and that is all based in the clipping mask. So if I wanted to do this in runs, I could quite easily new layer, clipping mask, and sort of build it from there. Now what I'm going to do now is sort of show you how we can actually add to our character or erase our character. So our B is right here. He's actually the silhouette, and if I decide that I think he needs maybe let's say an extra extra large stinger or something like that, I can't actually go to the clipping mask and do that because that's going to be confined by the shape. But what I can do is go to the B and go B for brush, and then I'm going to make sure that I am selecting once again a hard round brush because I'm affecting the silhouette, and then I can manually start going in. And you may wish to actually turn off, I actually need to make sure I don't have the opacity. I've got it back to 100. You can actually turn your clipping mask off, and then you can just manually start going through and redefining your silhouette. And what you'll actually see is that anywhere I've drawn over on the clipping mask is still going to allow me to see through. So you can actually re-edit on the run with this and make any changes that you want. Add a little antennae to the dude, and also erase, and it's also going to be relative to that. So your clipping mask doesn't get destroyed, it's literally just your silhouette. So that's really kind of cool, because if you do find something that's not working, you can change it, and then it's just a matter of repainting in your clipping mask. Now if you really want to get tricky and you want to start adding extra things to it, so let's say for example I create a new layer, and I'm going to drag that below the B layer. So, and I'm going to grab my brush, and let's say I want to add an extra set of legs to him. So I'm just going to quickly draw in something like that, extra set of legs, like so. Now that clipping mask is not going to be affecting that new set of legs. It has to be in that same layer. There is a way of getting around this though, and that could be to either merge these guys and reapply the clipping mask, or drop them in a group folder. Oops, I've actually yep. So shift select, drop them in a group folder. Now this group folder's actually got the clipping mask still attached in there, and I'm going to drag that outside of that folder. You can see all the furry bits where I've gone outside the lines, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reconnect that. So I'm going to right click, create clipping mask, and now what you'll find is that is now attached to that folder which has those two layers, and I can continue adding layers as long as if they're in that folder. That clipping mask is now going to affect that. So it is kind of a really cool way to make sure that you've got the ability to adjust your image should you require. So look, that's kind of one of the techniques just for sort of throwing down and getting your basic form. So start off big, then start getting in your details. Do think about where your light source is and how that's going to affect your image. Do think about things like rim light and refracted light and all that kind of stuff. And if you don't like it, it's very easy just to create a new layer and replace it as a clipping mask. Alright, let's actually talk about a few other really cool things for adding to your character. Now I'm actually going to jump online for this, and let's open up, I'm just going to open up Safari in this case, and I'm going to type in, let's go fur texture. Nice. Now ordinarily I'd have this done beforehand. I'm going to hit images, and a real big one I want to mention while you are finding images, get something that's going to be of a reasonable size for your image. So up until recently, Google Images did have a lot more options than it does now as far as finding images, but I'm going to have a quick look, see if there's anything that's going to work for me. And ultimately what I am looking for is something with a good contrast texture. So this one's kind of good, it's got a good contrast to it. This one here, not so much. So I really want to emphasize the textures on this. Look, I'm going to try that one there. Where'd he go? This one here. It's a little bit small as far as how much texture is available, but let's open him up, and it's quite a big one. Cool. It's about 4272. That's another thing that Google used to have that no longer has direct access to that. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to copy image. Cool. And let's jump back to Photoshop, and I'm going to paste that image. I'm going to go Command V to paste, and it's really big. So I'm just going to Control T to transform. I'll shrink that down a little bit, get a little bit close to where I actually want to apply it. Alright, now we're going to use the same sort of thing with this. So I'm actually going to apply this as a clipping mask to my object. So I'm going to think about using this as a texture on top of things. So I'm going to right click on there again and go create clipping mask. It is now attached to my insect. Now this layer itself has color, and sometimes you can find that's going to work, but what I'm actually going to do is convert this to black and white. I really want to focus in on my own colors once I'm done, so I'm going to switch this to black and white, and I'm going to do that by going to image, adjust, and go to black and white. And this is the best way of getting this to be black and white, because you have control over the colors. So you can ramp up the yellows as being lighter or darker if there's reds in there. So you can just push it around until you get a really nice texture that you like, and hit OK. Alright, let's get that back to being a clipping mask. So there it is there, and I'm actually going to be a little bit even more discerning about this. I'm going to transform this. I'm going to go Control T, and I really only want to get that fur part on the abdomen of my little bee character here. So I'm going to try to rotate that around, see if I can find a good placement for that. It's kind of getting there actually. Don't forget you can right click, flip horizontally, flip vertically, you can do all that distortion and stuff like that. And then once I'm happy with that, I'm going to hit enter. Now there are some issues with this, and hopefully you can see them as well. So one of the issues is that it's now overlapping on some of the wing. It looks kind of weird, and it really isn't blending in all that well. So I do want to kind of erase some of that, and I don't want to make it permanently erased, so I am going to be using a mask. So I'm going to go straight ahead on this clipping mask. I'm going to add a mask. So here's my little button here for adding a mask. I haven't selected anything. I've just pressed the mask button, and it creates this little white mask right here. And in that, remember, in mask world, anything white is visible, anything black is invisible. So I can switch to a black brush, and let's just make sure it's one that's going to be doing a decent cutout at this point. you know what, that should be okay. It's going to take me a few more extra presses with that, but I actually do want it to blend in, so rather than using a solid one, I'm going to use this one here. I don't want it on the legs, so I'm going to paint that in black, and I don't want it on the stinger either, so I'm going to paint that in. Now of course the other thing that's really kind of cool with this is if you do it softly, you can even get it to blend in a little bit more, so it's, you know, just more gradual. And in the interest of, you know, keeping this quite quick for a demonstration tutorial, I also want to talk about getting your textures to fit your object. So I've been quite fortunate in the sense that this clipping mask, I'm going to actually unclip it, release, right click, release clipping mask. You can see there's the shape of it. I've got the mask on it, and if I disable it, you can see I've still got the shape on there. So I've actually made this relative to the size that I've needed for the area that I want. Now if you don't, if it's, say for example, it's a much larger image, you may wish to trim that down for this next part. So to give you an idea, let's turn that mask on. I might just sort of go, you know what, I need this, you know, I don't need any of this part, so I'm just going to, in this case I'm using the lasso tool, just, you know, literally delete, make sure you're on the layer, not the mask, that part there, and I definitely don't need this part. You know, if it's stuff you don't need, try and trim it down to just the area that you're working on. You could also use like a rectangular selection tool. Oops, that's not a rectangular, it's an elliptical. Shift M and select it, and then inverse and delete it, or do whatever. But I do want to get it really close for this. I'm going to you know, reapply that as a clipping mask, create clipping mask. So you can do it. So it's back as being a clipping mask. It's got a physical mask on it as well, which is allowing me to blend in some stuff. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to warp this so it looks like it blends a little bit better to my character. Now in order for me to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually turn off this mask that's hiding all the other stuff around it as well. So there is a link between, I double clicked on it, there is a link between the layer, which is the fairy stuff, and the mask itself. I'm going to unlink that because I don't want to be necessarily warping my mask. Now there are situations where you might want to do that, but in this case not so much. I'm going to select back on my layer, I'm going to go Command T to transform, then I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to warp. So what I'm going to start doing now is actually start warping this around. I might actually have to redo some of this because as it warps around it's going to get a bit funky. But I'm going to try and warp this so it kind of follows the form of my little bee character, or whatever it is, insecty thing. As you can see, I'm going to have to redo my mask, so I should have done that second, but that's all good. Can always delete it. And apply. So hopefully, I'm going to Command Z, you can see I've gone from that, and I've just curved it around a little bit more. I'm going to jump back on my mask, or you could delete it and reapply it. B for brush, and I'm just going to keep blending that in because I don't really want to see, you know, those little lines, and you know, just turn that on and off and keep an eye out for any additional stuff that you don't want to see for that. Alright, so the other one to think about for this is also blend modes for this. This fur texture at the moment does not have a blend mode, it's just simply normal. The opacity is 100%. What you can actually do is just click on that normal one and start skimming through the blend modes, and what this will actually do is it'll allow you to, depending on what the underside brightness and contrast and color and stuff is, it'll blend accordingly. It's a kind of a random science to some degree. You can sort of predict what's going to happen, but sometimes there is a bit of a happy accident because you're dealing with you know, two different layers and how they interact. So all I'm doing now is I'm just adding some red stripes to give you an example of sort of how this is going to blend. So normal, you can see the transparency popping through, darken, and as we slip through, it's going to blend differently. So depending on the dark areas and light areas. So let's turn that off. Let's run through it, and I'm going to see if I can find something that's going to work for me. Overlay is usually pretty good. So the ones that usually find work are multiply, overlay. Soft light's kind of a lower version of overlay for that. And if you want to get some real funky stuff, then we start getting down into the near light, pin light, and also everyone's weird favorite one is difference, which is going to do like an opposite one. And you can get some really cool stuff with that. Be a little bit cautious with using difference, because it kind of looks like an X-ray, and it's a very quick gratification blend mode that a lot of people will just simply go, oh, you've just created like an X-ray difference of it. In this case, I really do kind of like it, but that's just me. So there we have it. We've added some texture to this, and we could add further texture to the eyes or the wings or anything else we want. I've thrown in some very quick values, and as I said, I really haven't spent too much time on this, just to try and get it as a demo. And you can see all these clipping masks here. Let's get rid of this one. That one sucks. And all the rest of it. Now I do want to show you another couple of really quick things that are potentially significant to this. I'm going to go below a little fly group here, and I'm going to throw in a gradient. I'm going to Shift G for gradient, and I'm going to try to put something in there that's quite colorful. Let's do this one here. By the way, you may not find the same gradients on your system, because Adobe does change the stuff up every now and again. Let's see if we can just kick this around. Do it that way. Alright, let's try that way. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm just going to give you an example of how your main silhouette is going to react if we start making it partially transparent. So our silhouette's going to be the vehicle that you can add your values and your textures to, but if I want to start erasing into that, I can actually, and I can start making it partially transparent, and you can do this by adding a mask to it. So I could do this to these individual layers, but they're in a group anyway, so I'm just going to add a mask to the group. And once again, I'm going to use B for brush in this instance. Could use lasso as well, and black is going to be invisible. So if I actually start painting that invisible, it's going to make that erase from my object. If I lower the opacity of that, or keep the opacity up and go for about 50% gray, that means that's at a maximum that's going to be 50% transparent. And of course you can vary that, so the lighter that is, the least transparent it is. But if I wanted to add some areas to this wing, for example, that were going to show me some transparency, I can do that by cutting into the mask with that. I'm keeping it roughly at about 50% opacity. If I want to make it completely opaque, invisible, I can switch to black, like so. Oops, that's not black, that's white. And I can cut through, and that's going to be completely invisible. 50% gray is going to be 50% visibility, and all the rest of it. And if I switch that back to white, I can make it completely visible yet again. And whatever I do to these layers, layer comps on top, as you can see, there's the one with just the grayscales. That is still, that grayscale now has the same transparency texture as well, even though the texture's on the body. And if I grab all of these guys, and let's link them in this case, or you can just move them, it doesn't really matter, it's just demo. What you will see is, so we've got something not moving. Looks like I've got something over the top. Oh, I know what that is. So you might notice there's kind of like a weird ghost thing happening here. That is because I have a mask on this one and it is unlinked. So I'm moving the object, not the mask. So I'm just going to relink that. That should sort that, and you'll see that that transparency through the wings, is going to allow me to change the background. It's still going to be semi-transparent, so that's kind of cool as well. Alright, so all of these are really fun techniques. The very final, I shouldn't say the final one, but one of the last techniques that I usually recommend is actually adding color to it, to your object. This can be a little bit tricky, but there are a few techniques in getting that popping up. So we'll have a look at that in just a moment. A different shading technique. So when we're dealing with our values light to dark to give our characters or objects form, and that is actually using the gradient tool down here. So if you hit G for gradient or click on the gradient tool, you've got the paint bucket and 3D material drop, but do select on the gradient tool here, and what you'll actually find is in our options bar we have a color gradient that's going to come up, and we've got some differing types that you can apply, that being linear, radial, angular, reflected, and diamond gradient. There are some blend modes. They're actually not going to work for us in this instance because we're actually going to be using a new clipping mask. So I'm going to create a new layer. Let's go ahead and turn that straight into a clipping mask. So it's going to link all the way back down to our silhouette layer. Alright, G for gradient. And first things first, I'm going to click on this gradient, which is currently white to black. Now your presets might be a little different to mine. I've got a whole lot loaded up here, but what you should see by default is basics. If you do the drop down here, you'll see our very first gradient is actually our primary or our foreground and our background color. I've got sort of red color here and black, and that's what we've got here. So whatever colors you've got here as your foreground background is what's going to be on your basics. The next one is your foreground color and then going to transparency, and the third one is a simple black to white. And then you've got a whole lot, pinks, purples, blues, all the way down to pastels and neutrals and stuff like that. So there's a whole heap in there, and you can create your own as well. Now I'm going to keep mine on black and white, but I do want to show you that you've got complete control over your gradients. So at any point you can click on one of these colors below, in this case black, go to the color option here and change that color as you wish. I'm going to cancel out of that. I'm going to drop in a point somewhere along here as an example and change the color there, and I can actually drop in a color at any point, and I can also start moving that around and also change the drop off between the next color along. So you can actually add multiple colors and you get some really funky stuff. If you don't like it, click on it, pull downwards, and that will undo that. The top part of the bar here, if I click on this, is the opacity. So the current opacity for this point here is 100%, and you can shift this around, and you can also lower the opacity at that point as well. So I can make that transparent completely if I wish, and we've also got the variation to drop off there. So I can actually drop in multiple points here, and let's select the middle one, lower the opacity, and you can see it's going from opaque to transparent and then back to opaque through there. I'm going to cancel that and step out. Alright, because this is a clipping mask, what I can actually do is click and drag to the points that I want this to apply, and there's my simple gradient there. And next one is a radial, click and drag, and it's going to give me a radial gradient. Depending on where I click it and how far I drag it is how that's going to be applied. If you hit reverse, which I currently have, it's going to be the opposite of left to right as far as the white being white's now going to be the dominant. So if I hit reverse, black is now going to be the center point for that as well. So you can switch around the direction of your gradient. Now unfortunately blend mode's not going to work because this is a clipping mask, so it's going to override that. But what I am going to do is show you the blend modes over here of the actual layer. So as I click through these, and we looked at this with the masks, is if I go to multiply, that is going to kick out the lighter areas, and if I go to something like lighten, it's going to start kicking out the brighter areas. And also overlay is going to have some pretty funky effects, and difference is going to do the opposite. So if I do want to have something that's going to maybe pick up the brighter areas, I might want to get lighten or multiply, but do play around with these. And I'm just going to stick with multiply. I'm just going to get those dark areas sort of figured out. And we can do this by also having a little bit more precision of where we're applying this. So at this point I've just done a great big fill on this. I'm going to grab my marquee tool. I'm just going to delete that so I can just start again. So what I really do suggest is, like, think about potential shapes and stuff like this. So using your lasso tool can be really useful for this if you want some hard shapes and that sort of thing. So you could potentially use your lasso tool to start selecting areas. And so, for example, I'm just using a freehand one here to select some of these wing areas, like so. And I might do some over this side as well. By the way, you can also use the pen tool, but I find it takes a little bit of time for that. And then I can grab my gradient tool, and I've already got the set to multiply, but let's see how it looks if I just drag that through left to right, right to left, and we might be able to add some really nice effects to that depending on what gradient works for you. If you're happy with that, you could potentially inverse that, so Shift Command Inverse, and then maybe you could flick the gradients the other direction or something like that. So that's kind of funky like that, and of course you can create multitudes of that. If you want to have your gradient affect another area specifically, I'm just going to do this really roughly and select this area. Alt to subtract, Shift to add, and as you can see, I don't actually need to be that accurate because it is a clipping mask, so that's pretty cool. I can just sort of go outside the lines for that. Let's give it a real rough one, and then grab my gradient, and let's try that radial one again. Let's see if we can do that. And then we can continue on from there. If we wanted to sort of do the opposite of that, we could potentially just sort of create a new clipping mask as well, and do the same sort of thing again. So let's reverse that, and I'm going to set the blend mode of this one to something like what was that one there? That was color dodge. It's kind of overburn, but we can lower the opacity of that, and then you can really start pushing just the variations of that. So in this case, it's not really that amazing because of the fact that this is kind of an organic creature. But if you were to do things like start making more hard shapes, mech parts and stuff like that. Let's do one real quick for like this nose piece here, and I'm just going to use the poly lasso tool just to get some nice hard shapes on that. Select, and once again create clipping mask. Getting through quite a few clipping masks at the moment. Let's try to reverse that. Do something like that. Get a gradient that's going to work for you, and let's set that to multiply, and I'm going to inverse that and just grab a brush, and let's go X and reverse, and we can just get that nice little hard edge